I came to the jungle seeking answers, not passion. But in the heart of the wild where danger and beauty intertwine, we found ourselves stripped of pretenses. Under the canopy of stars, with the jungle alive around us, I discovered a connection that defied boundaries. A moment so raw, it felt like the earth itself held its breath for us. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. There's a moment when you realize your life has slipped into a comfortable rut. For me, it came while staring at the same skyline I had photographed 100 times. The angles were sharp, the lighting perfect, but I felt nothing. As a freelance photographer, I was proud of my independence, but lately, the thrill was gone. Each shot felt more like routine than art. That's when the email arrived. The subject line read, "Wildlife photography opportunity in the Congo." At first, I dismissed it as spam. But when I opened the message, my breath caught. The editor, a contact from a small magazine I'd worked with before, was offering me a chance to document the untouched wilderness of the Congo rainforest. Raw beauty, she called it. A place that will test your skills and your soul. The pay wasn't great, but the idea of escaping the city for a while, of photographing something alive, raw, and unpredictable was irresistible. I booked my flight the same day. The first thing that hit me when I stepped off the plane was the heat. It wasn't just hot. It was thick, heavy, as if the air itself had weight. The airport was a blur of noise and color, and for a moment I felt overwhelmed. But then I spotted a man holding a small sign with my name. Lila Morgan. Kofi. I asked, walking toward him. He nodded, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his dark eyes calm but assessing. Kofi was older, maybe in his early 50s, with short salt and pepper hair and a face weathered by years under the sun. "The jungle isn't just beautiful," he said as we loaded my gear into a dusty Jeep. "It's alive. You'll need to respect it." His words stayed with me as we drove. The trail was rough, the Jeep jolting with every bump. Outside the window, the jungle rose like a wall, dense, vibrant, and teeming with life. Kofi spoke sparingly, pointing out the occasional landmark or bird call, but mostly letting the jungle speak for itself. By the time we reached camp, the sun was setting. The camp was basic: 2 tents, a fire pit, and a small stash of supplies. Kofi busied himself setting up while I wandered to the edge of the clearing. The forest stretched endlessly, its shadows deepening as the light faded. "Stay close," Kofi called. "The jungle welcomes no one after dark." I nodded, stepping back toward the fire. As night fell, the jungle came alive with sound. Chirps, rustles, and distant howls created an orchestra of life that was both exhilarating and unnerving. I lay in my tent that night, listening, wondering what I had gotten myself into. The next morning, we set out early. Kofi led the way, machete in hand, clearing a narrow path through the dense foliage. My camera hung around my neck, ready to capture the light streaming through the trees, the vivid greens of the canopy, and the flashes of movement as unseen creatures darted through the underbrush. "This is their world," Kofi said, pausing to let me catch up. "We're just visitors." I didn't fully understand what he meant until later that day. We had stopped for water near a small stream when Kofi suddenly froze, his hand raised in a silent signal. "Quiet," he whispered. I followed his gaze and saw it, a shadow moving among the trees. My heart raced as the shadow resolved into a massive silverback gorilla. He was enormous, his glossy black fur shimmering in the sunlight. A streak of silver ran down his back, and his dark eyes scanned the clearing with calm authority. "That's Kai," Kofi murmured. "He's a troop leader, one of the guardians of this part of the forest." Kai's gaze landed on me and I felt frozen in place. His presence was commanding, almost otherworldly. For a moment I forgot to breathe. My fingers twitched toward my camera, but something held me back. This wasn't a moment to capture. It was a moment to experience. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Kai turned and disappeared into the jungle. The silence that followed felt sacred. On the way back to camp, I couldn't stop thinking about Kai. His eyes, his presence, it was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Kofi must have noticed my distraction because he said, "You're lucky. Most people don't see him on their first day." "Lucky," I echoed, though it didn't feel like luck. It felt like something more. a door that had been cracked open, inviting me to step through. That night, as I lay in my tent, the jungle seemed quieter. Or maybe I was just listening differently. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I felt a pull toward the forest, toward Kai. The city and its predictable skylines felt like a distant memory. The jungle, with its wild, untamed beauty, had already begun to take hold of me. The jungle greeted me with its usual symphony of sounds, a chaotic yet oddly harmonious blend of chirping birds, rustling leaves, and distant animal calls. As I followed Kofi along a narrow trail, the morning sunlight streamed through the canopy, painting the world in shades of gold and green. "You're quiet today," Kofi said, his machete slicing cleanly through a low-hanging vine. "Just listening," I replied, adjusting the strap of my camera. It wasn't a lie. The jungle had a way of demanding your attention, drawing you into its rhythm. We trekked deeper than we had the previous day, the trail narrowing until it was barely more than a suggestion of a path. I found myself stumbling occasionally, my boots catching on hidden roots and vines. Kofi moved with practiced ease, his wiry frame navigating the terrain as if he had lived here all his life. "Does it ever feel overwhelming?" I asked after one particularly rough stumble. Kofi paused, glancing back at me. "It should. The jungle is alive. It doesn't adapt to you. You adapt to it." His words settled into me like a seed, something that would take root and grow long after we returned to camp. We stopped by a stream to refill our water bottles. I knelt at the edge, splashing cool water on my face. The jungle was quieter here, the sound of trickling water masking the usual hum of activity. It was then that Kofi froze. His hand shot up, signaling me to stop. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I followed his gaze and saw it, a shadow moving through the trees on the opposite bank. My heart leapt into my throat as the shadow resolved into a massive silverback gorilla. "Kai." He emerged slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His glossy black fur shimmered in the sunlight, and the silver streak down his back gleamed like a badge of honor. He was taller than I had imagined, his broad chest and muscular arms exuding raw power. I didn't dare move. Even my breath felt loud as his dark eyes swept the clearing, taking in every detail. When his gaze landed on me, time seemed to stop. "He sees us," I whispered, barely daring to move my lips. Kofi nodded. "Stay still. Don't provoke him." But there was no aggression in Kai's posture. If anything, he seemed curious. His eyes lingered on me, calm but penetrating, as if he were trying to decide what I was. A threat? A friend? Something in between? I wanted to raise my camera to capture this moment, but it felt wrong to break the fragile connection. So I stayed still, letting the weight of his gaze settle over me. Then, with a low grunt, Kai turned and disappeared into the jungle. As we resumed our trek, I couldn't stop thinking about him. "Does he have a family?" I asked, breaking the silence. Kofi nodded. "A troop. They're likely nearby, but he's the leader. He keeps them hidden unless he feels it's safe." There was a reverence in Kofi's voice that I hadn't heard before. It mirrored what I was beginning to feel: awe, respect, and a deep curiosity. "Why do they stay hidden?" I pressed. "Because the jungle isn't just home. It's survival. He knows what's out there: poachers, predators, even humans who mean no harm but bring trouble anyway." His words sent a chill through me. I glanced back at the trees where Kai had disappeared, wondering what it must feel like to carry the weight of an entire troop's safety on your shoulders. The day wore on, and the jungle seemed to close in around us. The trail became steeper, the air heavier, and I found myself sweating more than I thought possible. But the discomfort was secondary to the growing sense of connection I felt with this place. When we finally stopped to rest, Kofi handed me a piece of fruit. "You did well today," he said, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," I said, taking a bite. The sweetness was a welcome relief from the heat. "Tomorrow we'll go further," he added. "There's a spot where the gorillas sometimes gather. If we're lucky, you might see him again." "Kai." The thought sent a thrill through me. "Do you think he'll trust me?" Kofi's smile faded, replaced by his usual calm seriousness. "Trust is earned, and it can be lost just as quickly." That night I lay in my tent, staring at the thin fabric above me. The jungle outside was alive with sound, but it felt less overwhelming now. Instead, it felt like a language, one I didn't yet understand but was eager to learn. My thoughts drifted back to Kai, to the way he had looked at me. There was something in his gaze, something that felt like recognition. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just here to take pictures. I was here to connect with the jungle, with its inhabitants, and most of all with myself. The clearing felt different today. The morning light filtered through the canopy, dappling the ground with shifting patches of gold and green. I sat cross-legged near the edge, my camera resting in my lap, waiting. The air buzzed with the sounds of the jungle, but my focus was elsewhere, on whether Kai would appear again. I had been coming to this spot every day since our first encounter, leaving small offerings of fruit on a smooth rock in the clearing center. Each time, I stepped back to my usual spot by the tree and waited, unsure if he'd return. Today I had brought a mango, its bright red skin standing out against the earthy tones around me. I placed it on the rock and retreated, sitting with my back straight and my hands resting lightly on my knees. And then the trees shifted. Kai emerged from the shadows, his massive frame moving with deliberate grace. My breath caught as he stepped into the clearing, his dark eyes immediately locking onto mine. For a moment I felt frozen, not with fear, but with a profound sense of awe. He approached the rock slowly, his movements unhurried, as if testing the space for danger. When he reached the mango, he picked it up with his long fingers, turning it over once before taking a slow bite. I watched, barely daring to breathe. There was something almost human in the way he examined the fruit, the way his eyes flicked toward me briefly before returning to his task. After finishing, he looked at me again, his gaze lingering. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the weight of the moment kept me silent. Instead, I nodded slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement. Kai let out a low rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the air between us, and retreated back into the trees. That evening at camp, I couldn't hide my excitement. "He came again," I said to Kofi as we sat by the fire. "He ate the mango and I think he was communicating with me." Kofi chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You're reading too much into it, Lila. He's a gorilla. He takes what he needs and moves on." "No," I insisted, leaning forward. "It's more than that. The way he looks at me. It's like he's trying to understand." Kofi studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said finally. "But remember, trust is fragile. Don't push it." The next morning, I returned to the clearing with a renewed sense of purpose. This time I brought 2 pieces of fruit, placing them carefully on the rock. As I sat back in my usual spot, I wondered if he would come again, or if yesterday had been a fluke. The wait felt endless, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Just as doubt began to creep in, I heard it, a soft rustle followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Kai appeared, his presence as commanding as ever. But this time he wasn't alone. 2 smaller gorillas, likely juveniles, trailed behind him, their movements cautious and curious. My heart raced as I watched them, their wide eyes darting between Kai, the fruit, and me. Kai approached the rock first, taking one of the fruits. He didn't eat it right away, though. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing one of the younger gorillas to approach. The smaller one hesitated before grabbing the second fruit, retreating quickly to the safety of the shadows. I couldn't help but smile. Kai wasn't just a leader, he was a protector, ensuring his troops' safety even in moments like this. Over the next few days, my interactions with Kai became more frequent and more deliberate. He began to linger in the clearing longer, his posture less guarded. I started mirroring his movements. When he tilted his head, I tilted mine. When he tapped the ground lightly with his knuckles, I mimicked the gesture. To my amazement, he responded. During one encounter, he tapped the ground twice and looked directly at me. I hesitated for a moment, then mirrored the action. Kai's dark eyes softened, and he let out a low rumble, a sound that felt almost like approval. It was as if we were developing a language of our own, one built on gestures and mutual respect. One afternoon, I brought my camera to the clearing, determined to capture some of these moments. When Kai appeared, I raised the lens slowly, careful not to startle him. Through the viewfinder, I saw him in all his majesty. His broad shoulders, his piercing gaze, the way the sunlight caught the silver streak down his back. I pressed the shutter, the soft click breaking the stillness. Kai paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, and I lowered the camera immediately. "It's okay," I whispered, even though I knew he couldn't understand. "I'm just preserving the moment." He seemed to relax, his attention shifting back to the clearing. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That evening, Kofi noticed my quiet demeanor. "Something on your mind?" he asked as we sat by the fire. "It's just this connection I'm building with Kai," I said. "It feels real. Like he trusts me now." Kofi nodded thoughtfully. "The jungle has a way of teaching you things you didn't know you needed to learn. Just remember, trust isn't a one-time thing. It has to be earned every day." As I lay in my tent that night, I replayed the day's events in my mind. The way Kai had looked at me, the way he had allowed the younger gorillas to approach. It was more than I could have hoped for when I first arrived. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just an observer in the jungle. I was part of it, connected to its rhythms in a way I couldn't fully explain. And at the heart of it all was Kai, the guardian who had shown me that even in the wildest places, trust and understanding could bridge the gap between worlds. The jungle was alive with the morning's golden light, the air warm but heavy. Kofi had gone ahead to scout a new trail, leaving me alone by a small stream. I was supposed to stay put, but the thought of exploring just a bit further gnawed at me. With my camera slung around my neck, I ventured a few steps down the path, my boots crunching softly against the leaf-strewn ground. I moved carefully, scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement. My thoughts were on Kai. Would I see him today? Would he trust me enough to linger a little longer? These questions filled my mind, distracting me from the uneven terrain. And that's when it happened. My boot caught on a hidden root, and before I could steady myself, I went down hard. Pain shot through my ankle as I hit the ground, the impact jarring and unforgiving. I cried out, clutching my leg as the sharp sting gave way to a deep, throbbing ache. I tried to stand, but the moment I put weight on my ankle, a fresh wave of pain forced me back down. Panic began to creep in. Kofi was too far to hear me, and the camp was hours away. The jungle, which had felt so alive and vibrant, now seemed vast and isolating. I leaned against a nearby tree, my breathing shallow as I fought to stay calm. The symphony of the forest buzzed around me, oblivious to my struggle. And then I heard it, a low, familiar grunt. Kai emerged from the shadows, his massive frame moving with deliberate grace. His dark eyes scanned the scene, landing on me as I sat helpless on the forest floor. My heart raced, but not from fear. There was something about his presence that stilled my panic, replacing it with a strange, cautious hope. "Kai," I whispered, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his movements slow and purposeful. For a moment I thought he might leave, but instead he crouched a few feet away, his gaze fixed on my injured leg. His deep-set eyes seemed to flicker with something I couldn't quite name. Concern? Curiosity? What happened next was beyond anything I could have expected. Kai leaned forward, his massive hand extending toward me. I froze, unsure of what to do. His fingers brushed lightly against my arm, the rough texture of his fur contrasting with the gentleness of the gesture. It was as if he were assessing me, trying to understand the situation. Then, to my astonishment, he turned his back to me, crouching low. His posture was clear. He was offering to carry me. For a moment I hesitated. The logical part of me screamed that this was dangerous, that I was putting myself in the hands, or rather, the back of a wild animal. But the trust one had been building with Kai over the past days overpowered my doubt. With effort I climbed onto his broad back, my arms wrapping loosely around his shoulders. His fur was coarse and warm beneath my fingers. He rose slowly, adjusting to my weight with ease, and began walking. Kai's movements were deliberate, his every step calculated to avoid rough terrain. I clung to him, my injured leg throbbing with each jostle, but my heart overwhelmed by the sheer surrealism of the moment. The jungle around us seemed quieter, as if it too was watching this unlikely partnership unfold. I couldn't stop the tears that welled in my eyes, not from pain but from gratitude. Kai, this massive silverback, had seen my vulnerability and responded with an act of profound compassion. When we reached a familiar clearing, I spotted Kofi running toward us, his face a mix of shock and relief. "Lila!" he shouted, dropping to his knees beside me as Kai crouched to let me down gently. Kai lingered for a moment, his dark eyes meeting mine one last time. It felt like a silent exchange, a promise of understanding that words could never capture. Then, with a low grunt, he turned and disappeared into the jungle. Kofi examined my ankle, his hand steady but firm. "It's sprained," he said finally, wrapping it tightly with a bandage from his pack. "You're lucky it wasn't worse." I nodded, barely listening. My thoughts were still on Kai, on the way he had carried me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Kofi sat back, his expression unreadable. "I've heard stories about gorillas doing things like this," he said. "But to see it, it's rare, Lila. You've built something special with him." I looked at him, tears blurring my vision. "I didn't do anything. He just knew." Kofi smiled faintly, a rare show of emotion. "The jungle recognizes those who respect it. Maybe Kai does too." That night, as I lay in my tent with my ankle elevated, I replayed the day's events over and over. The way Kai had approached, the gentleness of his touch, the quiet strength in his every movement, it was more than I could have ever imagined. I had come to the jungle hoping to capture its beauty, to bring back images that would inspire others. But now I realized the jungle wasn't something to be captured. It was something to be understood, to be respected. And Kai had shown me that in ways words could never fully express. For the first time since arriving, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like I belonged. The days following my injury felt like a test. My swollen ankle throbbed constantly, forcing me to move slower and depend more on Kofi's help. Despite his pragmatic warnings to rest, I refused to stay in camp. I couldn't. The pull of the jungle and Kai was too strong. Each morning I hobbled to the clearing, my heart pounding with anticipation. Would Kai come again? Would our connection grow deeper? Or had the moment we shared been a fleeting kindness? It was midday when he appeared. The jungle around me seemed to pause, the sunlight filtering through the canopy to illuminate Kai as he emerged from the shadows. My breath caught at the sight of him, his massive frame as commanding as ever. But this time, his presence felt different, calmer, more familiar. Kai moved toward me, his dark eyes scanning my seated form before settling on my bandaged ankle. He crouched a few feet away, his gaze lingering with what felt like quiet curiosity. "I'm okay," I murmured, though the words were more for myself than for him. Kai tilted his head slightly, a gesture I had seen him make before. Tentatively, I mimicked him, tilting my head in the same direction. His eyes flickered with recognition, and he let out a soft rumble, a sound that sent a thrill through me. Our interactions grew more intricate with each encounter. Kai began to linger longer, his body language becoming less guarded. I started mirroring his movements deliberately. When he tapped the ground, I tapped it too. When he leaned forward, I did the same, keeping my posture open and relaxed. One afternoon, as the sunlight dappled the clearing, Kai made a motion that took me by surprise. He extended his hand, palm up, toward the ground. For a moment I hesitated, unsure of what he was asking. Then I reached out and mirrored the gesture, my palm resting lightly on the forest floor. Kai rumbled softly, the sound resonating in the air between us. It was a moment of understanding, a bridge between two beings who couldn't speak the same language, but somehow understood each other. The next time I saw Kai, he wasn't alone. Two younger gorillas trailed behind him, their movements cautious but curious. I sat perfectly still, my heart racing as they peeked out from behind a tree, their wide eyes flicking between Kai and me. Kai made a soft sound, a low, reassuring rumble, and the smaller gorillas hesitated before stepping into the clearing. They stayed close to him, their movements tentative. One of them, slightly braver than the other, ventured closer to the rock where I had left a piece of fruit. I smiled as the young gorilla picked up the fruit, sniffed it, and then darted back to Kai's side. The way he watched over them, his posture protective but not overbearing, filled me with awe. "He's introducing them to you," Kofi had said later when I described the encounter. "That's not something he does lightly." As the days passed, I began to notice more details about Kai and his troop. The younger gorillas were playful, often swinging from low-hanging branches or tumbling over each other in mock fights. Kai, ever the guardian, kept a watchful eye on them, intervening only when necessary. One afternoon, as I observed from my usual spot, Kai glanced at me and made a low, deliberate sound. I tilted my head, trying to decipher its meaning. Then he pointed, an unmistakable motion toward the edge of the clearing. I turned my head, following his gesture, and saw movement in the trees. Another gorilla, smaller and more timid, was watching us from a distance. I looked back at Kai, my eyes wide. Was he asking me to notice her? To acknowledge her presence? Slowly, I raised my hand in a subtle wave. The smaller gorilla hesitated but eventually stepped closer, her movements cautious. I stayed still, letting her come as close as she dared. That evening, as Kofi and I sat by the campfire, I recounted the moment with Kai and the timid gorilla. Kofi listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "The way you're describing it," he said finally, "it's like he's teaching you something, showing you how to understand their world." I nodded, my thoughts swirling. "It feels that way, like he's opening a door little by little." Kofi smiled faintly. "The jungle has a way of doing that, if you're willing to listen." As I lay in my tent that night, I thought about what Kofi had said. The jungle wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity, full of rhythms and relationships that I was only beginning to understand. And at the heart of it all was Kai. He had shown me that connection didn't need words, that trust could be built through gestures and patience. The bond we were forming felt fragile yet profound, something that transcended the barriers of language and species. For the first time since arriving, I felt like I was truly a part of the jungle. Not just a visitor, but someone who belonged. The jungle's morning symphony seemed quieter today, as if it too felt the tension in the air. Kofi and I had set out early, our machetes slicing through the dense foliage. My ankle, still tender from the sprain, throbbed with each step, but I didn't complain. The unease in Kofi's expression kept me focused. "Something's not right," he muttered, pausing to scan the trees. "What do you mean?" I asked, tightening my grip on my camera strap. He didn't answer right away, his sharp eyes darting between shadows. Finally he said, "This area. It's too quiet." We moved further into the jungle, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in fractured beams. The trail became harder to follow, the underbrush thicker. Then Kofi froze. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and firm. I watched as he crouched down, his hands brushing aside leaves to reveal a crude, rusted snare. My stomach turned as I realized what it was. "Poachers," I whispered. Kofi nodded grimly. "They've been here recently. This trap is fresh." A chill ran down my spine. My thoughts immediately went to Kai and his troop. The idea of them wandering into one of these traps was unbearable. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Kofi pulled out a knife, slicing through the snare's wires. "We dismantle what we can. But if they're nearby," he trailed off, his expression darkening. We spent hours scouring the area, finding more traps hidden in the underbrush. Each one we dismantled felt like a small victory, but it wasn't enough to ease my growing fear. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Kofi and I came across something that made my heart stop. A freshly laid trail of footprints. "They're close," Kofi said, his voice tight. "We need to move." But before we could retreat, the sound of voices cut through the silence. My blood turned cold as two men appeared in the distance, rifles slung over their shoulders. Kofi motioned for me to crouch, his hand gripping the machete at his side. We stayed perfectly still, hidden behind a cluster of thick vines, as the poachers inspected one of their traps. One of the men cursed loudly, kicking at the dismantled snare. The other scanned the area, his sharp eyes narrowing. My heart pounded as I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. After what felt like an eternity, the men moved on, their voices fading into the distance. Kofi let out a quiet sigh of relief. "We can't stay here," he said, his tone urgent. "It's too dangerous." "But what about Kai?" I protested, the panic in my voice rising. Kofi placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "We'll do what we can. But you need to understand, this isn't just their jungle. It's a battlefield." That evening back at camp, I sat by the fire, my thoughts consumed by the day's events. The poachers were real, their traps deadly, and the danger to Kai and his troop felt more immediate than ever. I glanced at the bracelet on my wrist, a simple braided band with a small wooden charm. It had been with me through so much, a symbol of strength and resilience. As I stared at it, an idea began to take shape. The next morning I returned to the clearing, the bracelet in my hand. When Kai appeared, my chest tightened with a mix of relief and sorrow. He approached slowly, his dark eyes scanning me as if sensing my unease. I knelt on the ground, holding the bracelet out toward him. "This is for you," I said softly, though I knew he wouldn't understand my words. "It's a piece of me, a way to remember." Kai crouched in front of me, his massive frame blocking out the sunlight. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine as he took the bracelet. For a moment he simply held it, turning it over as if trying to understand its significance. Then he looked at me, his gaze steady and piercing. It felt like he knew, like he understood the weight of this gesture. The following days were a blur of preparation and worry. Kofi and I worked tirelessly to dismantle as many traps as we could, always looking over our shoulders for signs of the poachers. But as my time in the jungle drew to a close, the reality of leaving hit me hard. I didn't want to say goodbye to Kai, to the jungle, to the version of myself I had discovered here. On my final morning, I returned to the clearing one last time. The jungle was quiet, the air heavy with an unspoken farewell. When Kai appeared, my chest ached with the weight of everything I couldn't say. He approached slowly, the bracelet still clutched in his hand. I knelt on the ground, tears blurring my vision as I whispered, "Thank you for everything." Kai's gaze met mine, calm and steady, and for a moment, it felt like the entire jungle held its breath. Then, with a low grunt, he turned and disappeared into the trees. As Kofi and I packed up camp, the jungle around us seemed quieter, as if mourning my departure. I carried the memory of Kai with me, his image etched into my mind like a photograph that no camera could capture. The poachers were still out there, the danger still real. But I left knowing that I had done what I could to protect this place, and the beings who called it home. And as the jungle faded into the distance, I realized that it wasn't just the jungle I was leaving behind. It was a part of myself, a part that would always remain here, in this wild, untamed world. The hum of the plane's engines was a dull roar, a constant reminder of how far I was leaving the jungle behind. Outside the window, clouds stretched endlessly, their softness a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of the Congo. I stared out, clutching my camera bag in my lap, but the usual excitement I felt about editing my work was absent. Kai's face lingered in my mind, his steady gaze, the way his massive hand had gently taken the bracelet. He was more than just a subject of my photography. He had become a part of me. When I returned to the city, my apartment felt impossibly small, its walls pressing in around me. The sounds of traffic outside were sharp and jarring compared to the layered symphony of the jungle. I unpacked my camera, setting it on the desk with the intent to review my photos, but I couldn't bring myself to open the files. Instead, I found myself standing by the window, staring at the skyline. It had once been a source of inspiration, the subject of countless photographs, but now it seemed flat and lifeless. The jungle had shown me what it meant to be alive. A week passed before I finally opened the images. The screen flickered to life, and there they were. Shots of towering trees, glimmering streams, and animals hidden in the shadows of the foliage. But it was the pictures of Kai that made my breath catch. There he was, his silver-streaked back gleaming in the dappled sunlight, his dark eyes calm yet intense. Each image told a story, a moment of trust, a connection that words couldn't fully capture. I felt an ache in my chest, a longing to be back in the clearing, to see him again. But I knew that part of my life was over, at least for now. Over the following months, I threw myself into my work, not to distract myself, but to share what I had experienced. My editor was thrilled with the photographs, calling them breathtaking and raw. She wanted an article to accompany the images, something personal that captured the essence of my time in the jungle. First, I didn't know where to begin. How could I put into words what Kai had taught me? How could I describe the way the jungle had reshaped me? But as I stared at the blank document, the words began to flow. I wrote about the poachers, about their traps and the threat they posed to the fragile balance of the jungle. I wrote about Kai, about his strength and gentleness, about the unspoken bond we had shared. And I wrote about myself, about how the jungle had forced me to confront my fears and rediscover a part of myself I hadn't known was missing. The article was published alongside my photographs, and the response was overwhelming. Readers reached out, sharing how moved they were by Kai's story. Some wanted to know how they could help protect the jungle and its inhabitants. Others simply thanked me for showing them a world they would never see firsthand. For the first time in years, I felt like my work mattered, not just as art but as a way to make a difference. One afternoon, I received an email from Kofi. His message was brief but filled with hope. The poachers had been driven out by local rangers, and the traps had been dismantled. He mentioned that Kai and his troop were thriving, their part of the jungle safe for now. Tears welled in my eyes as I read his words. Knowing that Kai was safe, that the bracelet I had left him might still be clutched in his massive hand, brought me a sense of peace I hadn't felt since leaving. Life in the city slowly resumed its rhythm, but I was no longer the same. I found myself seeking quiet moments, places where I could feel connected to the world around me. Parks, streams, even the small garden on my balcony became my refuge. The jungle had taught me to listen, to observe, to find meaning in the smallest gestures. And while I didn't know if I would ever return, I knew I carried the jungle and Kai with me wherever I went. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, I stood on my balcony and closed my eyes. I could almost hear the jungle, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and Kai's low, reassuring rumble. I smiled, letting the memory wash over me. The jungle was far away, but its lessons were etched into my soul. Kai had shown me that connection transcends words, that trust is built in moments of quiet understanding. And as I stood there, the city fading into the background, I felt a sense of calm. The jungle had changed me, but more than that, it had stayed with me.